Hi, I'm Mike Overly, author of Guitar Encyclomedia. This is Guitar Forum 2.0. Welcome back. Well, tonight we're going to talk about intervals. And these intervals this evening are going to be unplugged because we're going to be playing acoustic guitars tonight. And so I'll play a little bit of the show on classical guitar that has nylon strings on it and will give us a particular sound for certain musics that we're going to play. And then at other times I'll play the acoustic guitar, steel string, and that will give us a different sound and enable us to play different styles of music, actually. But regardless of the guitar we play, what we're really concerned about tonight is intervals. Now, intervals is a melodic and harmonic concept. So the idea is that if we have two sounds in music, then we can play those two sounds either as melodic, which means really like a melody, which is one at a time, or we can play those intervals, those two sounds, harmonically, which would be more like harmony, like chords and stuff like that. So what's happening now is we're going to begin with Pythagoras, who told us that if we take one string length and we play that one string length, then his student Aristotle said that we would create a ratio. And that ratio is a 1-to-1 ratio. And that 1-to-1 ratio would be one string vibrating as one sound or one string. And of course we would call that the fundamental, or in musical language we would call that tone 1. So this tone 1 now is a 1-to-1 ratio of sound. And if we now divide the string in half, then what we have is a 2-to-1 ratio. And that 2-to-1 ratio then is what we call the octave, and that octave then would be known as tone 8. Now, what we notice as we continue on with the harmonic series is that the harmonics continue to rise. So we have a tone 1, which is the fundamental. We divide the string in half, and that gives us tone 8. Now, as we continue, then we will divide the two parts of the string in half and create what we call a 2-to-3 ratio, or a 3-to-2 ratio, however you want to speak, and that will now create a rising sound, which is tone 12. Now this tone 12 is rising and it goes above. So what we find is that if we take the tone 12 harmonic and we then press the fret of the harmonic down, then what we do is we create what we call the fifth. So it's actually an octave lower, tone 12 in the harmonic, and pressed down and we get a tone 5. And then Pythagoras continued on and divided strings in half each time, 1-to-2 ratio, 2-to-3 ratio, et cetera, and created then the harmonic series and creating these ever-rising sounds. Now, what we want to do is stop at the tone 12, tone 5, because that's going to be our beginning interval. And that beginning interval now will be the fifth. So if we take any given pitch, let's start with E. So we have an open E string, and we add tone 5 to that. Then what we do is we create a fifth. And so now that becomes an interval that if we played one at a time would be melodic, 1 and 5. Or we can play it harmonically at the same time, and that creates a harmonic fifth. Now, as we apply these intervals now, as we would know them in the major scale, which changes our concept from the harmonic series now, where we find the sounds, into a scale where we actually play the 7 tones of a major scale. I'll take A for an example. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And in those 7 tones, then what we can do is we can create two sounds and play 1 and 1, which is called unison. And now we can have a 1 and 2, a 1 and 3, a 1 and 4, a 1 and 5, a 1 and 6, and 1 and 7. And what we've done is we've created these 7 intervals. Now, if we just take the 1 and 5, we have what we call the perfect fifth. And the perfect fifth then is used in conjunction with a 6, which makes a major sixth interval. So here's 1 and 5, and here's 1 and 6. And then that was the basis of many, many, many rock songs that we would find that would be 1 and 5, 1 and 6, and that would create like basic rock Chuck Berry type sounds. And now what we find is if we take those 1 and 5, 1 and 6 as intervals, then we can go a half step further and create the flat 7 which we call the minor seventh, and therefore we have a 1 and 5, 1 and 6, 1 and flat 7, and change it to the pitch E and play it melodically. And we have those basic sounds of early rock things, honky-tonk and things like that. So what we found is that the intervals of two sounds actually creates much harmony without going on to the next idea, which is add other sounds to that and create triads and tetrads and on with harmonic thinking on into chords. We'll just stick with intervals tonight and intervals unplugged. Now, in the history of sound, the perfect fifth was actually the sound that music was based upon as the most harmonious of sounds besides the octave of 1/8. Now we have 1 and 5s. And then the octave and the fifth became the most common sounds in the early musics because it sounded harmonious. Later on in the time of Guido, around 10th century AD, they said that this 1 and 5 thing sounds cool, but you can't do this 1 and flat 5 thing. And they actually called that 1 flat 5 diminished fifth, the tritone, and most importantly, they called it the devil tone because they didn't want to hear that particular sound in music. It didn't sound harmonious. However, you fast forward, many centuries, let's say, and you come up with people who use that sound specifically for the sounds that they want to play. And you come up with Hendrix and Purple Haze and sounds like Black Sabbath and other kinds of music that actually decide to use the perfect, the diminished fifth, the devil tone, as an actual selling point and songwriting concept. So the idea now is what we really want to create with this interval situation is that harmony is really, to put it simply, two melodies. Now those two melodies can be played one at a time or at the same time. So let's begin now with what Bach would do with his intervals. Bach started with one single melody, and it was a high melody, and therefore it's called treble. Treble means high. And he would come up with and then what happens with that melody is that it doesn't sound like harmony because it isn't. It's only one sound. And therefore you would call that a melody, and since it's high, we would call it a treble melody. Now, if we take a different melody and we play it in the low sounds, which we would call bass, then we would have a second melody. Now, both of those melodies, one at a time, is not harmony. And so therefore, in the lesson tonight, which is based upon harmony, if we play two melodies simultaneously, then we create intervals, and those intervals create harmony. So two melodies played at the same time is harmony, and two sounds is called an interval. Now, earlier we talked about how if we played these two sounds in the same octave, then those are just called their intervals. So like a perfect fifth or a sixth, those sounds then are actually just called intervals. Now, we have the next concept called compound intervals. Now, compound intervals are when you play the octave of that particular interval and play it in the second octave, let's say, and you create a compound interval. And so instead of just playing 1 and 5, we would play 1 and 12. Instead of playing 1 and 6, which we call major 6, we would play 1 and 13. So what we find is we have compounded intervals by playing the first octave tone number in the second octave, and it's larger than, and therefore they call them compound. So the idea now is if we take the melody of Bach in the treble side of things and the bass side of things, then all we have is two melodies. Now, this also is a concept of why guitar is an important issue, is because guitar and piano too, there are a few instruments that can play harmony on the single instrument, which is in contrast to orchestral instruments like the flute or the trumpet, where you can only play one sound at a time, monophonic instruments, and therefore if you want to hear harmony in an orchestral setting, then what happens is you have to go to the orchestra. And when you think about it that way, then that actually gives a reason for an orchestra, and that is so that monophonic instruments can actually hear harmony. So if you're at home playing your flute by yourself, you're never going to hear harmony, but if you go to the orchestra and play with others, then you do. And so the orchestra is cool in that sense. But with that said, that's the cool thing about the guitar. The guitar is an instrument that can actually play harmony by itself, and hence that creates a lot of its popularity. So now we have these two melodies, and now we'll play those two melodies at the same time, and when we do, it creates the harmony. And now we hear those two sounds at one at a time. Now, if we think about this in the intervallic way, then we say that this G that I'm playing is like tone 1, and then the E is 13, and that'd be a compound interval. So. If I can remember it. So something like that. Anyway, what that is really showing you that even with only two sounds, you can make beautiful music, and if maybe perhaps we all practice more, we'd even play better. So that's the idea on that if we take two separate melodies and play them at the same time, then we actually have harmony. Now, as we move over to the acoustic guitar, then in fact what we do is have exactly the same information that we've had earlier, but now it takes on a different sound. It has its metal sound, and now all those sounds that we played take on a much sharper sound, but in fact the music is the same. And that's one of the beauties of Bach itself, is that it really doesn't matter what instruments play his music, it always sounds beautiful. So what we're now going to do is we're going to look at how we would think about modern, more modern musics than Bach. Bach, that Bourrée piece is around, say 1722 or something like that, 18th century music. And now if we fast forward, say 300 years or so, then we could come up with another extremely popular song that was created by the Beatles. And Paul McCartney, of course, knew all about the Bach Bourrée and all that kind of music, but necessarily didn't want to, of course, play it or even try to play it, I guess. Although I don't know that. Maybe he did. He never recorded it, though, as far as I know. But he imitated it. And he imitated it in such a way that what he did was he took that harmony of two sounds and then applied it to a popular song that actually was a big hit for the Beatles. So if we take those two sounds again, only this time put it in like a Beatles song, then what's going to happen is that we now create this G, and we have this B, and that'd be a compound interval of the 12th. Or actually, that's the 10th. G is 1, B is 3, and an octave higher than 3 is 10. So it's a major 10th. Now, that major 10th sound can be played many different places on the guitar. So what we find now is that we have this, what they call open concept of sound. And now if we move someplace else on the guitar and play the same tone 1 G and tone 10 B, but play it in a different place, then we have G as 1 and the B as tone 10. And now we create the 10th, the major 10th. Now, if we take major, which is tone 3, tone 1 and tone 3 as an interval, either melodically one at a time or harmonically at the same time, then we could flat the 3, and that creates a minor interval, and that would be a minor third. And then, of course, the minor third in the second octave would be the minor 10th. So major 10, minor 10, played someplace else on the guitar, major 10, minor 10. So what's happening now in the Paul McCartney idea of the Bach idea, of the intervallic idea, is that if we take one sound and play it with the other sound, we have harmony. Now, that was cool as a beginning thought, and he was imitating Bach in that sense. So here's what happened. There's the first two interval sounds, the second two, and the third. And what we're really doing we're sketching out harmony that could be understood in a much more complex way as we would move on to triads and chords and things like that. One thing to actually interject at this point is that intervals of two sounds are not a chord. A chord needs at least 3 different letters, which is 3 different sounds, to become a chord. Actually, the two sounds is very specifically in music called an interval. So now what happened was, Paul says, well, this is kind of cool. It sounds like the Bach thing, but I'll just play these sounds instead. But, of course, it's hundreds of years later and needs something with a little bit more action. So what he does is he adds what we call on the guitar the open G. And this open G then enables him to alternate between the interval sound and then a single sound on the open G. And by alternating between those intervals and that one single sound open, he created that sound. So throughout this progression that he's going to play, he's going to continually alternate between that open G sound. So now he has the first interval with the alternated G, the second interval with the alternated G, and the third. And now the tune is beginning to emerge. And then everyone would recognize that, who would recognize it, as Blackbird by the Beatles. Now, as we continue on with that idea, then what we're going to find is that he advances the harmony and creates what we call passing chords, or passing intervals, actually, in fact, in this case. Normally, you would hear it as passing chords, and that's generally the way it's said. But in this case, since we're doing the interval thing, then it would be called passing intervals. So what's going to happen, he's going to take this, the major 10 thing that we heard that actually outlines major, and plays with the alternating G thing. And then what he's going to do, he's going to play a passing, which would really be, in the case of what we're saying, if we were talking chords, in this case it would be C major that goes to A7 with C sharp in the bass, passing chord in that context, but just the interval sounds, C major intervallic relations, A7 passing, D major, B7 passing. So he creates this. Now that next thing that happened was he's going from what would be E as a major 10th and minor. So he creates the E minor based upon that major 10th, minor 10th. Tone 10, flat 10. Then he hangs on to that and lowers the tone 1 concept down a half step and creates E flat major. So E minor, E flat major. And then works it backwards. Minor. So he keeps doing this major, minor, which sounds really cool in its interval way. So Blackbird. then he throws in a bridge that still used the same intervallic relationships to it, starting on F, the F major, the 10th. And then E minor, D minor, C major, and then his first really new sound in the song, B flat major. So he has. So we can see that from coming out of an earlier time, 18th century kind of thing with Bach, Bach had great influence on all of us actually, and many, many songwriters and composers that realized that you could just play two sounds and imply many, many other sounds. And then of course this is a cool aspect of music itself that says how important the listener really is. So if I only play two sounds for you, your own mind is filling in all the other concepts of not the concepts, but the other sounds that would make that round out into an actual much fuller major sound. And minor, you would hear it as being those other sounds. So the listener has a great deal to do with the perception of music, and therefore Bach and those who made music based upon intervals realized this. And of course Bach has many, many works called the two-part inventions, where he does nothing but play only two sounds, and yet it sounds so rich and full because it's the listener that fills in all the space, shall we say, between the two intervallic sounds. So as we look at the Bach piece, which that is based upon the two sounds, Paul uses his little alternating G thing that gives it the sound of really like there's threes, and creates his sound. And then using the cool ideas of majors and minors and passings, and every once in a while throwing in a pitch that's never been played within the song before, he created a hit. And that becomes a very important concept. Now, in the relationship of intervals, then intervals can be played in different ways on the guitar by, let's say, tuning differently. So if I play the guitar in standard tuning, then its pitches are E and A and D. Fingerstyle guitar, which I'm playing today, right, because I'm not using a plectrum known as a pick, right, I'm just using my fingers. We can create these other sounds by doing alternate tuning on the guitar. And what we can now do is we can create an intervallic sound of two, which would be an octave, based upon the 4-string D on the guitar. But what we're now going to do is take the E of the 6th string and detune it down to D. So that now in a fingerstyle way, we're using this interval concept, which in fact in this case is the interval of an octave, because now that low D, that drop D, is now tone 1, and its octave higher is tone 8, and now we create this alternating concept that was the alternating concept that Paul used in his. We'll just alternate this other sound in between the interval sounds. So now what's going to happen is we would do the same thing. We would use this alternating octave interval and then play a third sound as an alternation. And so we can see that that droning kind of sound of the octave is then becomes the fundamental sound behind the melody play. And of course we could play a melody on the first string. So it's another use of interval in guitar play, but it enables us to round out in a drone way the sounds that would be for the melody. Now, if we take the drone sound of the octave, play one single melody, and now play another sound in relation to that melody, now we have two sets of intervals. So we have our octave interval on the sixth string and the fourth string, and now we have two sounds. Now, if we put those two sets of intervals together, now, theoretically, of course, and technically too, that would really sound like four things, but really it's two sets of intervals. And therefore we can see that this begins to grow on us and become much more than what we had originally started with, which is just two sounds played separately called two melodies, play those two melodies at the same time and create harmonies, and two sounds of harmony is called intervals. So, I hope that you enjoyed tonight's introduction into harmony as we know it as intervals, and I would leave you with the thought of, I hope that you go get a guitar or some harmonic instrument and begin playing intervals and enjoy the sound that two sounds can bring. So till next time, I wish you the best of all good things. I'll see you here next time.